Good.
How many show of hands, like, who here has a decent amount of experience fixing pinball games? All right, great. Oh, this is a good audience because then we can go into detail. We can demystify how pinball machines work. So that's great.
Yeah, so like I said, we're going to start off with flippers. So in addition to being able to work on pinball machines, I'm a fantastic graphic artist. I think this took me about 3 hours to make this crude drawing here. But nonetheless, this shows the basic layout for it. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about is kind of the earlier solid state era of stuff, late 70s through the mid 90s, or
early 90s.
Yeah, and this is going to be kind of the basic setup of, regardless of who the manufacturer is, this is what you have. You've got your, this is just kind of a simplified block diagram of it. So coming in, you have your, your main fuse. It's going to go through a bridge rectifier to convert the AC to DC. I didn't draw the transformer in there. Pretend there's a transformer in there. And you're always going to have somewhere in there, you're going to have a game over relay that shuts the flippers off so you can't hit the buttons while there's no game being played. And you can see that the positives, and this is across all manufacturers, you'll see that the positive side of things goes straight to the flipper coil. You're controlling the flipper with, you're basically grounding the other side of it to activate it. And it's kind of important to know that when you go into troubleshooting, the way you kind of test things. So you can kind of follow, if you go backwards, you can see that the ground goes back through your flipper button, through the game over relay, back to your power supply. So that's just, like I said, kind of a block diagram of what's going on. Since I have this diagram up here already, we can kind of talk about the coil itself. So you're kind of close to Cal, I think you can see that still. But you see, basically I have it broken down into two separate coils. So once again, the era that I'm talking about of, like, let's just say the 80s, all your flipper coils are really two coils in one. You have one winding in it that is usually a heavier gauge wire, fewer turns, and then you have, there may be a better name for it, I've always just called it the power coil.
Yeah, or the power side and the hold side.
Yeah, and then like Kyle said, you have the holding side, which is a smaller gauge wire and a lot of turns on it. And if you were to measure the resistance of it, this is just rough, 3 to 10 ohms on the power side, and I have 80 to 200. It may go outside of that, but drastic difference is the point if you're trying to identify which one is which. So you see your flipper coils will have 3 terminals. One will be a common, and then you'll have access to either one of the other coils from there. With diodes on it, some of your coils may only have one diode, some of them will have 2. We'll go into that in just a little bit about why they're there and what the orientation is. Actually, the orientation, we can talk about that right now, because it's very important that you get that right.
It's easy to remember, sort of. A diode is a component, when you bring it down really simply, a diode is like a one-way gate for electricity. Right, it makes sense. It flows in one direction, but not in another. So we would read that on this schematic here by the way it won't flow is that straight line there. And if you see where that straight line is pointing to, it goes to the positive side of the power source. Like Eric said, when you actuate a flipper button 100% of the time, I can't think of any that doesn't do it this way, you're completing the circuit via the ground. So your flipper coils will always have 50 volts, 48 volts, whatever the game runs on, present at the power side of the coil. It is super important to make sure you don't get those diodes backwards, and that's when you start blowing things up, which is fun, but it can be frustrating to find. Generally, it's also, a lot of times if you buy a flipper coil, the diodes come pre-installed. Maybe from the factory they have them installed one direction, but the new one maybe has them another direction, and someone's like, oh, let me just hook it up the same way I took it off. It's really important to just understand a little bit of the basics of what you're trying to do so you cannot make that mistake.
And that's a good point. A lot of people will snap it. If you're working on something underneath a play field, you're going to take pictures of it before you do it so that you can go back to it. And that is a problem because you'll take a picture, okay, the blue wire, okay, snap a picture, okay, here's the neutral, and it won't be right. Because, you know, diodes will be backwards on the new coil. So if you understand what the diodes are for, and you kind of think about that part of it, you can just, you know, you can take the wires and you know how it should go.
Can you explain the phenomenon of like the collapse and spike?
Yeah, okay.
Because I can't do that well, so.
One flipper, two flippers. Is this circuit?
This is just one flipper. I even
One
though
side, okay.
It is just one. Like I guess to explain a little too. The reason there are two windings is you need to be able to hold a flipper up, right, to cradle a ball.
Right.
But you also need the flipper to be powerful enough to send that ball from the bottom all the way to the top of the playfield. So you will have a very powerful, like Eric was saying, a higher gauge, a thicker wire wrapped less times, thus giving you, we'll just call more power. And then you'll have the other side that has a thinner wire wrapped a bunch of times, and that's a high resistance side. We'll talk about the end of stroke switch soon, but I guess we kind of have to talk
might
about
as well do it now, yeah. But back to what, Kyle, you were saying,
This devolves, it gets turned into a snowball pretty
This is
quick.
going to be total chaos, all right? So a flipper coil, it's an inductor. They're a bit synonymous, but a coil, it's almost like a capacitor in that it kind of stores power, but in a very weird way. Let me get to the point of this. When you give power to the coil and you take it away, it will release energy back reversed. All right, I know that's kind of tough to follow, but basically if you clip positive to here, negative to here, let go, it sends a huge spike reversed of that. You don't need to know all the tech behind it, but just know that that happens.
That is why the diode is important. That one-way gate keeps that reverse power influx from going to a space to blow things up. That is why the diode is important.
Yeah, and they have different names. They call it clamping diode, flyback, freewheel. They have different names for its function. But just think of this, like if you have positive here, negative here, and you release the power, you got a positive here, huge, like if this is 40 volts, you could have 200 volts, for a millisecond, and it uses this diode to basically kind of shunt that power. Once again, we don't need to go into detail about, I can explain it, but it's not necessary. Just understand that that's what it's for. If you do put it in backwards, I said it's bad, but really what will likely happen is you'll just blow a fuse. If you don't have an enormous fuse in the block, like sometimes you may have. So you know what? Since this diagram is up here, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about what the end of stroke switch is.
So if we go back and talking about how every flipper solenoid is two solenoids in one winding, right? You have your power side to allow the flipper to whap that ball, get it all the way to the top of the playfield. But if you hold the flipper button down, that really low resistance side of the coil will get really, really, really hot rather quickly. The goal of the end of stroke switch is once the flipper reaches its maximum travel, the end of stroke, once it's gone from here up to here, it will physically open this switch, allowing both of these coils to be energized at the same time. So taking a 5 ohm low resistance coil and then turning that into a 205 ohm resistance coil, thus not allowing things to overheat. You can almost indefinitely hold that flipper up at that point. The end of stroke switch is a very, very, very critical part in I like to call this like a mechanical action flipper, a flipper from the 80s that requires the flipper to break that end of stroke switch. If they get dirty, you'll have a really weak flipper, right? There's going to be a blockage in between here that will not allow the power to only travel, not only travel, you'll just have dirt.
It will, okay, so once again, this is normally closed. So if you think about the power, positive coming in here, you're going through this power coil and you're skipping over this.
Electricity will always choose the path of least resistance.
Yeah. So it skips over this, and lots of power, full extension to the top. This opens, now you're going in series. You're going and then out. If this is improperly gapped, if this never opens, you'll get about 10 minutes of play out of it, and this will melt. Or blow the fuse, but it usually melts.
Generally both.
Yeah.
The end of stroke switch is really important to have, like Eric said, adjusted correctly and also to be kept clean. If it is not adjusted correctly and it opens too early, you'll start combining both of those coils together, thus creating a weak flipper. If it's dirty and not closed all the way, electricity will have to pass through both of those coils, thus creating a very weak flipper. Sometimes, in some cases, they won't even work at all. The hold winding might not be enough to actually pull the plunger in and raise the flipper.
Yeah, yeah. And if you like, oh, my flipper isn't working, you've got the glass off and you hit the flipper button, you kind of hold up and you'll hear, kind of it'll be vibrating a little bit. And that's.
And if this sounds very amorphous, which it kind of is, this wonderful display that Eric put together. At the end of this, welcome you to come over and take a look because you'll be able to see all of this in action as well.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So you're talking to a mechanical engineer. So
Okay.
Right. So indications that I'm having problems with my flipper is that it's a very weak, Chandler-looking flipper, or it's not fully engaged forward, correct?
There are so many issues you can have. The biggest one is not enough power. That's going to be your biggest complaint. You could have mechanical issues or, well, electrical issues, but it's, it's more going to be mechanical. Even if it's electrical, it's usually kind of a mechanical electrical thing.
Right.
But yeah, it's, the low power is the big one.
Okay. All right, go ahead. Finish.
All right, so, and while we're on this, we may stay on this diagram for a little while, but one thing you'll notice with this of your path, because, with electrical circuits, you have to complete the circuit. Well, what you notice, if you're going all the way around, you've got multiple things going on here. How good is your end of stroke switch? Well, also, what about your flipper button? All the current that goes through this, goes through that flipper button, goes through the game over relay. Game over relays, in all the years I've been doing this, you don't see that fail often. It does happen.
It does happen.
But it's percentage-wise, it's very, very, very low. Yes, sir.
All right, so you mentioned something about the end of stroke switch and how it could burn up or burn up, that thing called. So how often should that be
Replaced?
replaced?
There's no good answer to that other than to inspect it and see how it looks. This is a new one, and here we go. This is one I found. This is what will happen to it over time. It's not a real good picture, but this is kind of what happens to them.
They're, the reason that they start to fail that way is when you are completing that circuit, it's decent voltage, things spark, right? These switches, a correct end of stroke switch will generally be a fat contact, a very wide contact, not a very small thing.
Spark? Yeah, you don't see that when you're playing, but that's what's happening every time.
Generally, they're tungsten coated.
Yeah.
And that tungsten coating allows them to arc without eating away at the softer metal underneath.
Right.
So they actually do last a really long time. What will happen if they're not properly adjusted or they're cleaned incorrectly, that's when you'll start getting premature wear. There was another photo. Can you go back to one of those other switch?
That's the same switch. So
you see, that looks like it's been filed a lot.
it has been filed. Okay, so this is the same switch. When you're repairing this stuff, when you have the bad stuff, you throw it away. So I was looking through all my supplies, trying to find the worst one that I have. This is the best I can come up with. As Kyle mentioned, these are tungsten contacts. All your other switches underneath the playfield are a gold-plated whatever, but it's gold-plated, and they're kind of self-cleaning, but you have to be very careful. So like all the switches in your game are these gold-plated contacts, and when when you push the contacts, they do that and then they wipe just a little bit. So the more you play the game, the better the switches work. Because they, once again, they kind of self-clean. But when you clean all your switches, you have to, there's various methods, business cards or whatever. But these contacts, they're tungsten, and you can file them down, and they are tough. They're really tough. I mean, you can get your Dremel out, or take them off and go on a, so.
Yeah.
And you can get some more life out of them by grinding them down.
Okay, the thing is the flipper itself. So how much for the contacts and the flipper?
Like price of the
Replacement.
Not very much, thank you. I mean,
Thank you
you're
very
talking maybe a couple dollars a switch. But the thing I think that's important, and I wanted to mention this after your first question, is like pinball maintenance is not like car maintenance, right? There's no like prescribed take it to the mechanic every this much. A lot of it is fixing as problems occur. I know that I read in a Williams service bulletin from the 90s that Williams said that their flippers will start to age around 500,000 actuations. When you think about it, that sounds like a big number, but I mean, I don't know.
If you have 1,000 plays on the game, that might be, I don't know the...
Things can start to wear out pretty quick, but in actual practice, I mean, things generally do last quite some time. And in a home environment, that's almost like putting a pinball machine into a museum. They just do not wear out anywhere near like a commercial location or an arcade environment, right?
And when you're buying, I mean, we all know how much pinball machines have gone up in price, right? If you're buying a older pinball machine for $3,000, spending $50 on a rebuild kit for your flippers is just, it's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing. It's
also a good way to familiarize yourself with your new device, right? To get in there and be inspective of what's going on and trying to gauge the health of the ecosystem of your pinball game.
And this is probably the highest, this is probably what's going to be replaced most on your game of all the components of it. Are you going to pop in?
No, yeah, wasn't there some era of games where the EOS was normally open?
Well, okay, so they started doing, this all goes back to EMs. And in the 90s, I don't know who did it first, but like the Williams, when they came out with their WPC 89 system, not the very first ones like Adams Family. Well,
Adams Family was the first game.
Was it the first game?
It was the first Fliptronic game, but that's a whole other.
And so, and it changed everything. Instead of, it still had we kind of skipped over something. One thing about the end of stroke switch is, okay, flippers up, it's using the holding coil. You don't see this in the real, if you see us have a slow motion camera, a ball can come down and hit it and knock the flipper down, and it'll close that switch again. Then you've got the power to push it back up again. Yeah. So so the newer style games that have an end of stroke switch that are open, all it's doing is your driver board that now have transistors that control the coils, and it has a transistor for each coil. When we're not talking about the newer stuff, we're not going to go into the pulse width modulation or any of that.
It gets complicated, but this pertains to basically every pinball game before Adams Family. That is what you can kind of base a lot of this on. Where are we going with the switches?
Well, I have this picture up here just to show that if you do have, if you've got very uneven or pitted or whatever, you can file it down. You can get a little bit more life out of it. I mean, depends on, if you've got the parts, replace them, but if you don't, you can fix it by filing it back down.
That pertains to the flipper switches too.
It does. The flipper switches are also tungsten. Once again, pre-Adams Family, before they went to the Fliptronics, they were like that. Let's see. And we can go.
One of those flipper diagrams might be good to make some of this a little bit less amorphous, right? So can we go to the non-linear flipper?
So this is a Williams flipper.
So what we have is there's that long metal plunger with the spring around it, connected to that flipper pawl. And if you notice the...
okay. Well, no, that's not good. Yeah, we'll stay on this, sorry.
The end of stroke... Yeah, I'm going to stand up now. The end of stroke switch is here. When this energizes, the coil is going to magnetize this plunger, pull it in, And as that rotates, this pawl moves, and this arm is what actuates the end of stroke switch. Notice it's closed. When the flipper is at its end of stroke, when this is bottomed out, it is rotated fully, that switch is now open. That's what we're going on about. That is where the arcing happens. But this is why the adjustment, you might read this all the time, make sure it's gapped correctly. Gapping an end of stroke switch is also really important for flipper performance. You want to make sure that as the flipper closes and reaches its end of stroke, this switch is opening at the end of stroke. Imagine, so if we had this thing opening while it was half stroke, right? We would then combine both of those coils and get a really, really weak flipper for almost half of its power stroke. The prescribed distance or opening is, I mean, I eyeball it, but the manuals say 1/8 of an inch at the end of stroke. It needs to be open just the teeniest amount.
Yeah, and you know, I've never read, you know more about that than I do, but I just, you know, I go for that kind of that last 10% of the, because if things settle in a little bit, and you know, once again, if that switch never opens, that's bad news. You know, so yeah, and you know, there's these you can bend these to where you need it to be. Oh, you know, speaking of bending, that's another thing. When I put a new end of stroke switch on, when you get a new one, two things. When you get a new end of stroke switch, I still file them down a little bit. I've noticed that I don't know if it's maybe like a little bit of coating on it or something, but I do just a little bit of filing on them when they're brand new. And when I put them in, I kind of put, so, you know, they're closed like this, I grab at the bottom and kind of make it where they're pushing even harder against each other. I mean, you want to have good contact on those. You know, I've helped some of my friends put some new end of stroke switches in there, and like, it's still not that strong. And I tell them to do that, and like, that worked. Yes, Simoto.
Colin Baxter wants to know, why doesn't Data East have EOS switches?
That's all right, outside the scope of this one.
So Data East did something kind of weird. They like a Ninja Turtles, the first one. They have two different power supply. They've got, don't quote me on these voltages, but let's say they've got a 20 volt and a 60 volt power supply, and they've got a little board in there and it's a timer. So they run like 60 volts to the coil for so many milliseconds. Assume that it's going to go full extension, and then it changes down to 20 volts. So they you know, 60 volts, then 20 volts on a timer. And the problem that caused was what I was talking about earlier. If the ball hits the flipper,
has no idea when it's
doesn't
changed
know.
States.
Yeah.
That's
So it was a very poor design is the answer to that.
Yeah, so they touted it as, you don't need to clean your end of stroke switches ever again.
Yeah.
You don't need them. And then that started happening. They're like, oh wait, just kidding, we're going to put them back. And it was just a whole thing. But yeah, that's what we would call a solid state flipper. So that's a little outside of what we're trying to go over.
Yes, sir.
My next question is LED flippers and LED flipper buttons. Is there a challenge in retrofitting those into any machine, additional wiring or something like that?
I couldn't quite hear all of what you said.
The LED lit flipper buttons?
Correct, as well as I just saw recently, LED flippers themselves.
Oh no, that's just an add-on accessory. You're not altering the infrastructure of it when you're doing that.
Generally, you're clipping an LED to a light, and then you point the light at a clear button, and it just illuminates it.
So that's what it is?
Yeah, I can show you how that might work on this at the end too, for sure. Yeah. Should we move
Okay,
on?
yeah, let's.
Is this making any sense? Is it?
I hope it's helpful.
A little bit of following along. Okay.
Yeah, and this is just the assembly, and I just have this to show the names of it. So you have the plunger, the pawl, the linkage assembly.
Yeah. So the plunger.
Sorry.
The plunger is the metal cylinder. The link is a plastic bit that is pinned to the plunger, and then it is bolted to the crank or the pawl. The link is purposefully the weakest point. If there was ever anything that would jam, you would want something to fail in a prescribed spot. That is why they are made of nylon. previously they were made of like a weird fiber board.
Phenolic.
Phenolic, yes. And there's actually
Yeah.
one right here.
Yeah.
It's disgusting, but you can come see it after the.
And I brought some of these so you could see, Kyle, you probably can do it better over there, but that is, so that, we were talking about the electrical component of it, the end of stroke switch, but now we'll jump over to the mechanical
Yes.
aspect of it.
All right.
Because this is, yeah, mechanical, right? And you've got a whole linkage over there, but when you get a brand new one, it's gonna be pretty tight.
They're pretty tight.
You've got 2 points where they can, where that bolt goes through, and then you've got this, like a little
A
pin.
roll pin.
Yeah.
So if we think about the forces exerted on the flipper crank assembly, the coil energizes, magnetizes the plunger into it at a high speed, and it yanks on that plastic link. That stress over a long time will start to oval out these connection points right here. And that is where you will start to see the mechanical loss of power in a flipper. When the coil has to energize and start pulling on this thing, if there's this has a ton of slack.
Yeah, I brought that one because that has a lot of slack.
When there's a couple, when there's up to maybe 2 millimeters of movement that needs to happen before this entire thing starts moving, that is translated to your control as a really sloppy or weak flipper.
And it won't, the full extension won't be as high. It manifests itself in multiple ways.
It
but, yeah.
cause all sorts of issues. But again, these are things that you'll find on very old games that you may purchase, or games if you are working on them in an arcade. Again, if you purchased an old game, or a brand new game for that matter, and you put it in your house, again, your games do become a museum piece. They do not wear out nearly as fast as anything on commercial location. I mean, again, they will wear, especially if you play them a lot. But the amount of plays, I mean, Erich works with the Game Preserve, right? And you have thousands of plays on your games a month.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
back in the day, I mean, in the 90s, Mike, I mean, what were games getting played in arcades in the 90s?
You were getting like, a good game on would be like 50 cents per, so probably 600 plays a week.
When you get your first pinball game, you might play it 100 times in a week, and then maybe next week, maybe 60, and maybe you'll play a little more the next week, but it does peter off eventually, and those sorts of wear levels are just nowhere near what they get played in the wild, right? So I'm just
Yeah, and that's 600 plays, but I mean, I could have played a half an hour long game, which means I had an obscene amount of flips in the game.
So that being said, if you were to buy a new game or you were to rebuild your flippers, it's not something you're going to need to do every year.
Yeah, you don't have people spilling beer down it.
That too. That's gross to clean up.
Okay, so barrel goes inside the coil, so it kind of sandwiches it in there, and yeah, right there. And you can imagine the forces of it just pounding it, and I didn't have a good example of this, but that's about as best I could find, but you can think of that more exaggerated, so the end of it just mushrooms out over time. And go ahead.
You'll see that on the plunger as well, if that's what you were going to say.
You're right, yeah.
And that can cause a lot of friction inside of the coil sleeve, which we'll go back to. When the end of the plunger starts to mushroom out the same way, it causes a lot of drag as it's trying to move, right? As a rule of thumb, actually no, I'm going to say this very affirmatively. Every time you change your coil stop or your crank and link, you should replace the coil stop at the same time. Both of these things, what they do is they end up wearing together.
They fit in each other in a kind of a concave way.
So if you had a really blown out coil stop and you put a brand new plunger and link in there, it's going to wear this prematurely. They'll start wearing very oddly, and you will have terrible flipper performance. So it's generally, and always, if you want to take my advice, I would recommend replacing both of them together as a unit.
Yeah, just get the whole flipper rebuild kit and do it all at once. These are the nylon bushings that go inside it, and they used to use a metal, like a brass, or when it started using nylon. Oh, by the way, there is no lubrication in any of this stuff. Real important. A lot of
Yes.
people will do that, and I mean, don't put graphite, don't do anything.
They
It's-
run totally dry, and that's thanks to
this.
this nylon bushing. That sleeves inside of the hollow center of the coil, and that is what the plunger rides in as it starts to actuate. So think about it, like if you did start to have that mushrooming tip on the flipper plunger, it's going to have a lot of drag against that bushing. As metal on metal contact happens, right? What happens when you slam two sticks together? They start to chip. That's what happens with the metal too. So that's why you have a very clean new one and a very dusty one to the right. When they start to get dusty and grimy like that, that also starts to inhibit smooth movements of the plunger. Generally,
This probably is the least likely to cause a problem out of all the components of a flipper, I would say. I mean,
Yeah.
you can clean them out, but I mean, they're going to be part of the package of the flipper rebuild kit.
they're inexpensive, and if you're putting new parts in, just replace those sleeves as well. They do become problematic when coils start to overheat.
Oh,
Someone
yeah.
neglected their flippers for some time and they started to get hot. The bobbin, the nylon bit that all those wires are wrapped around, they do start to swell. And when they start to swell, they push on those bushings.
And you never get it
They're
out.
very difficult to remove from the coils.
And
at
you
that
take
point.
something and kind of try to scrape it, but you get really frustrated,
Yeah.
and then you just replace the whole coils. So, I've seen a lot of, they market coils like, oh, they'll have fancy names for them, this is the more powerful coil. A coil is a coil is a coil, in my opinion. I mean, when you wrap a 21 gauge wire X number of times around it, that's all it is. There's no
reason to get really fancy with them. I mean, there are times in some games where you might want to install a more powerful coil, perhaps. There's a lot of people swear by in the Lord of the Rings game, putting a little bit hotter of a coil into it to make the ramps a little faster and smoother, but as a rule of thumb, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I would never change the specification of a coil from what the manufacturer calls for. Especially in older games, if you start throwing hot rodded or really powerful coils into them, you will start breaking things. They were designed to use a certain resistant or a certain power of a coil, and if you start really hot rodding them, you'll start breaking targets and plastics left and right.
So unless you've had a failure where you had a coil overheat and melt some plastic, they last forever. I mean,
Yeah.
they last indefinitely.
Generally, they're good until they're not.
Right.
If you do have an instance where it is very difficult to remove one of those bushings, I mean, I would say that's probably about fair game to replace the coil. But generally, I mean, do you agree with that
Yeah,
statement?
even then, I've gotten the guts out of it and reused it, and it worked fine. But it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean,
But yeah,
I think people like to replace the coils because that seems like the easy solution, but there's so many things that work in
it's
concert,
not the problem,
as you've
yeah.
seen. But yeah, sometimes you can get by, my background fixing games in arcades, you need if it's 10 o'clock on a Friday night, I need this thing to work, so sometimes you'll do things very different than if you, as a customer, brought me your game to try and make it as nice as possible.
Oh, the fixes I've done over the years, I probably wouldn't want people knowing.
I don't document many of them, but I'm proud of a lot of them. Yeah, I don't know. Is this kind of, are we still making sense? Is this flowing a little bit? It'll make a lot of sense when you come and look at this beautiful jig that Eric whipped up last week.
I think this was kind of the end. Yeah, this is all the slides I had on that. Now, while we're still on the flippers, and any questions about any of this that we talked about?
What didn't make sense? Please tell me that, not everything I said was coherent, so please tell me.
I mean, how much tuning is there? Like, if you install a new set of flippers, will it feel like it?
Actually, that's something I didn't touch on because
That's a good question.
once you're putting everything back together, and the different manufacturers. Let's see if I can go back to it. Like we have a Bally and a Williams on here.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the Bally. Bally's will have 2 set screws, and it you basically crank down on the flipper to when you set it.
This is the flipper, right? This is the bit that goes
Yeah.
through the playfield. So this is spinning that shaft with the flipper attached to the other side, just so that makes sense.
So when you're installing it, you kind of take one hand and you make sure that you kind of grab this, you make sure it's at full extension so that it's in its all the way down position. It's a tricky thing the first time you do it because you got to get everything right.
Yeah.
You'll know where you want it. You need to have a little bit of up-down play. Let's see, how can we explain it? Okay,
Well,
here we
there's a
go.
lot of things in concert that need to be adjusted the correct way.
See this up-down right here? You have to have a little bit of that. Marco has these great little feeler gauges that help you set that. So they have to have, that one's a little sloppy right there. If you don't have that, you'll get friction on it and it will, so
the flipper passes through the base plate through a nylon bushing. That bushing sticks up through the playfield and makes sure that the flipper rides true, perpendicular to the playfield. If you don't have that free play, that crank, right, the bit that's actuated by the plunger, will start to bind up against that nylon bit. That's why there needs to be some free play. So you make sure that you don't bind this way, like the sandwich way. You had a question, sir?
You mentioned something that there's no grease or oil necessary for any of the flippers. But I'm looking at it from a mechanical standpoint. If those two metal pieces, is there no lubrication in there?
No.
No
Not
nylon
at all.
washer or anything like that?
I mean, you have that nylon sleeve that the plunger rides through in the coil.
Right.
You have the nylon bushing that the flipper rides through, but the lubrication and dust don't get along, right? If we start putting any sort of
Okay,
lubrication
yeah.
or grease and it starts to mix with metal flakes, you quickly turn into a polishing compound, and that, it gets goopy and nasty. And
that nylon bushing can't really see it in there.
Right.
They're very solid. They will, last a long time.
But to answer like the things in concert, right? You have the free play is really important up and down. When you're installing these new components, you need to make sure that when the flipper is at the end of its stroke, the switch is opening just the right amount. And as Erich said, you have to actually ensure that they're sitting together. When you get them new out of the little box or bag, they look like they're rather close, but you need to really ensure that there's a good mechanical closure. It takes time. It is not something that is really like a plug-and-play thing. There is a feel to it that you just have to, you will grasp when you get things right. It does take some practice. This takes a lot of practice. It's not an overnight thing. How long have you been working with, when did you buy your first pinball game? Or did your working on them predate owning one?
1988.
I was not born then. I got my first pinball machine in 2007, and I've been working on them for money full-time since 2012. And so I am by no means an expert. I mean, I learn something new every day.
I do too. So the Bally one, the ones that have the set screws in it, what will happen is once you crank those things down, and you really need to crank them down with
Yes.
the and that's not going to be the position on that flipper forever. So if you crank it down and you're like, oh man, I wish that was just a little bit higher, a little bit lower, forget it. It's going to go back into that same spot. Swap the bats.
Yep.
And
the set screws make big indentations on the flipper bat. When you get those indentations, you'll never be able to micro.
you can take put the shaft on a grinder and try to, nope, doesn't work. It's going to find that same spot again. The Williams ones kind of clamp down on it, and the one thing, this is my opinion of it, you got to really put some force on that thing.
Absolutely.
It will. You're like, this feels good. I got it, and then you play it, and then it moves. I'm like, ah.
We'll go with the picture of the Williams one so you can kind of show that.
It's a 3/8.
You've got the nut and bolt go through here, and that clamps around the shaft. So you've got two different ways of pinning and holding that flipper bat as it rotates.
And this will kind of bend in a little bit.
There's good examples of that here when you guys want to, if you want to come up and be
You can
hands-on.
adjust that easier after the fact.
Yes, you can always adjust
Yeah,
that.
very much so.
Okay. Any other flipper stuff?
I mean, all day. We could go for like 10 hours.
Eric, where do you buy your pinball supplies? It would have.
Marco.
Yeah, I'm a Marco, but the Planetary Pinball, the Steve Resource, you know.
Well, I mean, you know, it's yeah, the Gottlieb stuff. He kind of has the. Well, that's not true. You guys have Gottlieb stuff as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the arcade, for myself, we get everything from Marco. But I mean, there's plenty of sources out there that I'm not going to say here because No, I really do. I really do get everything from Marco.
Yes, I work at Marco, so I will definitely say get everything from Marco. We try to have everything in stock and have what you need. So it's the nice thing about buying from us is there's really good shipping. We get things to California from South Carolina in like 2 days sometimes. So leave the building in the same day and you'll get your stuff. So if you want them fast, you know where to go. Yeah, flippers they're insanely complex. This is just like not even digging an inch under the surface. There's a lot going on, and there's so many intricacies to so many different games or different eras of these mechanisms. But I don't know. Hopefully, that's a little bit of information to help sink your teeth into and visualize. And I definitely want everyone to play with this.
If you want to come up here and we can flip it around and you can see the Bally had two different types of flippers. They had the linear style. What, do they have a name for those style?
Just a linear flipper.
Yeah, and they're very similar in the,
It's funny though, because if you do look back all the way to the first flipper, Humpty Dumpty in 1948, they're very, very, very similar to the same flippers that are on James Bond, the brand new Stern game sitting in the booth right now. There have been innovations.
They figured it out right the first time.
They figured it out right the first time.
Except we have no diodes on our coils anymore.
Yep, and they're single winding. There's only one winding, and that is a complicated thing to explain.
But I can explain it if you want to get all nerdy, but...
we can all have a beer and talk about flippers if you want to. But
how about other pinball repair-related stuff?
Throw some questions our way.
Please.
Okay. Are you using canned air to clean stuff with?
I don't. I've never really... I don't make it a point to clean any of the stuff. I mean,
if it's really dirty, I do like to wipe it down sometimes, but that's just because I'm neurotic about keeping clean, but...
Yeah, over time, it just, you'll get just kind of like a black soot kind of, coating underneath that, and...
yeah, you'll see that on these parts.
Yeah.
What about the electrical cleaner that they have?
Contact spray, so that's really more for connectors, like the connectors you have in the back box, and the bigger ones. So there's two different pin pitch on it. You've got 0.100 and 0.156. The bigger stuff carries more current. You don't really need to do that with those. But like your switch matrix contacts or the smaller ones, there's the stuff I like to use is deoxit. And it works pretty good. However, if you've got an old Bally game, like an old Dash 30, any of the stuff from the 80s, one of the things I like to do if you want to have trouble-free operation, yes, you can take those connectors, you can spray deoxit in it, and it improves things. But it's best to repin those connectors, both sides. Replace the male headers on the PC board, desolder them, take them out. Once again, I'm talking about the smaller connectors. The bigger ones, they're usually okay. But I replace those male headers and I'll repin the connectors, all those for all the lights. Because oh man, that light's out. Well, it's not really out. You go wiggle the connector up there and then it starts working again.
We can do a whole Bally repair seminar. Eric and I like old Bally games more than anything else, so we can talk about this.
Oh yeah.
I would just recommend not using anything that's anywhere close to sort of slightly being flammable around the flippers. I've seen people catch things on fire by WD-480ing their flippers, by using contact cleaner when a more physical abrasive solution is the best choice to clean switches. So yeah, when in doubt, just, use a file.
I have one question for you too.
Yes.
How often should you change the batteries out in the game?
So the older stuff, all right. The answer to your question is I would say a year, but don't do that. Catch up to newer technology.
Yeah,
all those chips you've got. It's a 5101 RAM chip that has the battery backup. get that thing out of there, replace it with non-volatile memory, then you don't ever have to worry about it, because then you forget about it for a few years. You open up and that corrosion's all over the place.
A huge problem with pinball games for a long time is, operators that bought the games, they knew that batteries existed on the board, right? So they would know to change them, but as soon as that game stopped earning money and they yanked it out and sold it to someone in their home, they had no idea that there's batteries on their computers, right? And then that is why in the early 2000s and the 90s, there's so many games that were just destroyed by battery corrosion. I don't know, who has a game? Tell me a name of a game. Twilight Zone has batteries on the computer, right?
Well, Shadow, but
any of the Bally Williams games?
Want to get the chips, the older, connectors to put the batteries.
Yeah, you got remote. You can take your battery. Right, exactly. So it's always 3 AA's and you can get a holder and move it off the board.
I always just get rid of the batteries altogether, because it doesn't matter if I fixed a game for Erich and then Erich sold it to someone else and now they don't know that there's batteries in there, and you run into the same problem. It's more expensive a lot of the time to replace the RAM. Sometimes on certain boards you do need to have a PCB working skills to be able to unsolder things from the board and then put them back on. There's plenty of professionals that'll do it, but I would totally stand behind removing the batteries from your game 100%, just to really be sure, right?
If you do the remote battery, like on the older, like your, what do you say, Shadow, that's a WPC game. It's meant for AA batteries, but older games like older Bally stuff, it's meant for a rechargeable battery, so you have to put a diode in line with it when you do that. So,
and if you were going to mount remote batteries, which is also fine, just put them as far away from the computer as possible. When I do it in the WPC games, you've got the computer on the left side, and I'll always wire them like way down in the corner by the speaker, as far away from the electronics as possible. So if they start to go rotten, you've got time.
Battery corrosion is a very odd thing, a phenomenon that I don't understand. It propagates in such weird ways. It's almost like a liquid, but not really. And
I have a weird one.
Yeah.
It'll travel through a wire.
I had a customer as an Adams family. I used to go work on it a decent amount, and they didn't call for like 4 or 5 years, and things are all screwed up. Okay. So they didn't change the batteries like I asked them. This was also in like 2010, when it was not as common to get those NVRAMs and stuff like that. But the batteries had eaten through, or started to leak, and they started leaking down onto the switch connectors that end up going to the playfield. This guy's, Adams family, had battery corrosion that ate through the header, and you probably feel like 20 or 30 feet of wire that was going all over the place, all the way to the shooter lane switch. So from all the way up here to all the way down here, it was nuts. I had to run new wires through them.
It's crazy.
Awful. But
it does. Battery corrosion can follow a wire.
It's so bizarre.
And that's the WPC era games. That's what's common. Where the batteries are, the switch matrix, there's some chips right below the battery, and it always eats those up. So you start losing your switch matrix on it. Yes?
What's the price of one with a non-battery?
The non-volatile memory.
Yeah.
The chips, after COVID, the chips have doubled in price. They used to be about 20, now they're about 40. If you have skills to desolder, you can do it all yourself. But just understand that $40 thing could save you hundreds.
$300 on a computer and all other assorted issues.
I used back in the day when you couldn't get replacement MPUs, I fixed that stuff. And I won't touch it now if I see any corrosion, because the problem with the battery corrosion, you can neutralize it. You can do all these tricks to neutralize it's not acid, it's a base, I think. But anyway, it's like you never really feel like it can come back and haunt you later.
Yeah.
It'll work, and then like a month later, it's something else that's messed up. So it keeps eating through,
a lot of the times you can fix them, but it kind of turns into one of those sunk cost fallacies. Like, I charge $120 an hour to come to your house and work on your pinball game. I could sit there for an hour and a half, maybe charge you $180 to try to fix your computer with corrosion. But there's no guarantee that in a year that corrosion isn't going to manifest and cause problems. And at that point, you've spent $180 and plus another $300 for a new computer when you should have just bought a new computer. Sometimes you have to work on that stuff though. There are boards that are not reproduced. There are some games that are very difficult to get parts for electronically, so you do have to work on that stuff. But
We're in a pretty good time right now.
Yeah.
Just about everything's
It's
being
crazy.
reproduced.
You can get
now.
new everything for lots of games now. It's really amazing. But yeah. Anything else?
Seems like the Gottlieb games last forever.
They do.
Yeah, well, the earlier Gottlieb
60,
stuff.
70 years old, you know, they're just let's keep on going, you know.
Yeah, the earlier Gottlieb stuff was still prone to battery corrosion on it. The System 1, System 80, 88.
But the
all that.
EMs are built like tanks.
Yeah, they are.
Electromechanical games.
The engineering of the last Gottlieb stuff, the System 3 stuff, I thought was pretty good. I
Yeah.
think they really, they came a long way on it.
One of the most
Very
reliable
solid.
systems. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some good games too. Stargate. I love
was good,
Stargate.
yeah.
Now, you all check out a lot of the, going to LEDs and some of the other games and replacing them.
Say that again, Johnny?
LEDs, they put a lot more LEDs in instead of.
What do you think? This is a question you can ask 10 people and get 20
Yeah,
answers.
there's no correct answer for that. I mean, you know, it does change it. The way the lamp driver board on an earlier Bally game works, they use, instead of, they don't use a matrix, they have what's called an SCR that drives every lamp, and it's meant, when the engineers made that board, they said, okay, a lamp, a 44 or a 47 lamp uses this much current. We've designed our board for this, and that's how it's done. They didn't know 30 years later that people were going to put LEDs that use 1/10 of the current. Well, the problem that causes is that, once again, I could get super geeky on you and explain how an SCR works, but it causes this crazy flickering problem. And so you really you either have to put a resistor on every LED that you put in there, or buy a complete different lamp driver board. So, I mean, I kind of went off on a tangent to your question, but it uses the good side is it uses a lot less current, so it's less stress on a lot of the stuff.
Yep.
Less heat as well.
Lots less heat. I like to use LEDs in the general illumination of a pinball game. You have two sets of lamps. The general illumination are the ones that just kind of light the game, light the plastic, and then you have your feature lamps or controlled lamps, and that's what the computer switches on and off to tell you, shoot here, or this is how much bonus you have. I prefer to use them in the general illumination just for a bit more light, right? You can see a little bit better, but also these are commercial pieces of equipment that were designed to last for like 2 or 3 years, and they get thrown in the garbage and the new game takes its place, right? So there are lots of the connectors that would bring the power from the source, the transformer or the driver board, to those lights they were underrated, and you'll find a lot of problems on especially Williams games and Data East games from the 90s where they burn up. The
Yeah.
connectors get very hot. They pull too much current, the pins start to get hot, they tarnish, and then now that they're tarnished, they start to pull even more current, and they just self-destruct until they burn and melt away. So I generally, if you brought me a game, if it had a burnt connector, I would replace it, and then at least swap out 20% of the bulbs to LEDs just to reduce the issue to almost zero in the future. Some people don't like the colors. It's very
Right,
there are a lot of opinions on this.
Yeah, when the LEDs first started coming out for the games, the white ones were very blue, I guess that's a high color
really
temperature, very cold, and they've gotten so much better. They've gotten to the warm white now. I mean, but once again, it's very subjective.
I don't like putting LEDs in my feature lamps. I prefer the glow of an incandescent lamp. A lot of those games from the 90s have these beautiful light shows that are programmed in to sweep up and down the playfield. And that is also calculating in the amount of time it takes to add voltage to the bulb and let that whatever filaments glow really red hot and then fade away. This is me being super neurotic, but go in there and look at some of those older games and watch the way that the lights sweep over the playfield, and then you'll start to notice LEDs are just very jarring. They're just on and off.
Yeah,
right?
there's
no burn in, burn
there's
off.
no ramp up and ramp down.
Yeah, there are products that you can use to fix that. If the product is actually called the LED OCD board.
Yeah.
If you have those obsessive compulsive things like I do, it's a perfect product for you.
And I bet they sell a lot of them.
They do, yes. I actually just got one for my Twilight. So,
Yes, the Philip website's unloaded.
Yes, oh, I love that game. Yeah, LED, in my opinion though, generally good. I like warm white LEDs. I like that they preserve the, colors of the original game while also adding extra light and reducing current draw, but if you don't like them, use them stealthily, right? Put them in places to reduce that current draw, but also improve lighting.
The new games, when you go play a new Stern, they're so bright. It's great. The light, they figured out how to,
Position things and add light well.
And you go play, even like Adam's Family, you go back and play like, oh, this is really dark, you know? So, there's a lot to be said about bringing up the brightness of, a game. And it's like the stuff from the 70s and 80s, there was very sparse, so there wasn't really a whole lot to light up. But, when they started putting all these component, all the mechanisms in there, it got kind of dark. Yeah. All right, so we're about to run out of time, and I think we have some giveaways, do we not?
Yeah. How are we going to give them away?
How are we going to do this?
Well, I think we need to make sure we give them to people who...
We had a couple of people that were higher level of participation.
I think that gentleman might need a goodie bag first off. So please come and grab one. But we do, so we have these little tool bags that are set up.
I'll be calling you real soon.
All right, okay, you got it. I don't know. I like pinball trivia, but it's kind of. I feel like maybe you need to ask the first question.
Yeah. Okay. Pinball trivia. In the 90s, the WPC games, there were 2 games that did not have the title of the game on the translite. What were they? No. No. No.
You're disqualified until someone else tries.
No.
I'll answer that. Nobody else
in the
does.
safe way.
All right.
It was Whitewater and Adams Family.
That's
correct.
Yeah.
They don't say the name of the game on the back glass. It's kind of weird. You would never notice that.
And there's 2 new games that do it.
And one with Pat Laura, one with Dennis Thorne.
Yeah. What? Really?
I don't think. I'm pretty sure Halloween. It was Halloween. The new Halloween. I'm pretty sure that doesn't have it on it.
I guess Michael Myers says Halloween better than the word Halloween could.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll drop down. These should be easy. The first talking pinball machine.
Gogar.
Johnny.
Come on up. Gorgar was a really neat game. It was a 1978 Williams game that had a speech processor board, and it said like 8 words.
Yeah, and it would rearrange them to.
Yeah, take different sounds to create different parts of a word to make another word. It really bizarre. Williams also released a record, a little like 7-inch record. Actually, it wasn't. It was square,
It was
wasn't
a
it, Mike?
flexi disc.
It was like a flexi disc
Yeah,
that said all the words that your Gorgar could say.
Yeah.
I've had a few Gorgars in my life, and they're hard to sell. Nobody wants the devil in their house. It's a scary back glass.
I like it.
Love it.
Okay, I need to think of something, another good one.
Okay, I've got. If you draw a blank, I think I can come up with something.
Well, when Chris and I, the guy I used to work for, has forgotten more about pinball than I'll ever know. But we'd be driving all over the place, and he'd be asking me the most insane trivia questions, like, what is the game? What's the WPC game that has the most motors? It was just like, I don't know. It was the answer, I'll tell you, is Roadshow. There was one motor, shaker motor, one bulldozer blade motor, and then 2 motors for Red and Ted's mouth. 4 motors. But there's also another one. Whodunit. There's one for the roulette wheel. Wait, no, there's three for the slot machines, and then what's the other one? I don't remember, but that's the other one. And now you've got 2 pinball.
The up-down target bank.
That's it. Yeah, the target bank. So there you go. Now you've got pinball trivia. You asked the other one. You go for it, Eric.
The first solid-state pinball machine with multi-ball.
Okay.
Oh, I know.
That way.
Riley's on?
No, way earlier.
Way
than
earlier.
that.
I don't know.
Firepower.
Yeah.
All right. Once again, solid state. Adams Family sold the most units,
Right.
20, a little over 20,000. What's number 2?
Firepower, 8-ball deluxe?
Oh,
Flash?
And you know
was
what?
Flash.
It's who said that. It's
Nice work.
I have to remember which one is which. It's either Flash or it's 8-ball, not 8-ball deluxe, but 8-ball.
I'm pretty sure,
That's one
sure it's Flash.
It's 8-ball
They're
deluxe.
really, really close.
8-ball deluxe was the world, had the record until Adam's Family came along.
Was it?
Nah, I'm going to, I know you know a lot more than I do, but I'm gonna disagree with that statement.
Because I remember
You know,
hearing-
unless they, you know what, maybe if they counted that the funky LE version was in.
Steve
in
Ritchie
that.
told me that they stopped making Flash because they wanted to leave the market wanting for more games. They sold, IPDB says Flash sold 19,505 units.
The Adams Family sold 20,000 with 1,000.
The gold.
So let me
one.
see,
Say 8-ball, see what 8-ball deluxe is, and they may separate, because they had 3 versions of
Right, if you
that.
add them all together.
Yeah,
kind
they
of
had
as
the
one
first
final.
one, and they had another one with the back glass
The LE.
swung out, and then they had the LE, the rapid fire that.
Right.
So the original was 8,250 units, but then I think they made another like 5,000 of each of the others, something like that. The Midway one, I can't read. I hate being on my phone in front of all of you, but I need to put this in my memory banks.
Yeah,
They actually don't have a production number for the Midway one, the 3rd edition one.
that's the one with the swing out door. I don't think they sold that many of those. It's kind of like, yeah, you
Total,
see
it was
the,
like, it was around 20K when you
Yeah.
added the 3 together, and that was, and Adam's Family beat it by like 1,000.
Huh.
you've all seen the commercials where, you know, Ford says the best-selling truck in the country but Chevrolet and GMC are counted separately, and if you add them together, it's more, but they don't say that part.
But the Hummer is the largest one because the military.
Oh, yeah?
Ah, good point.
Hummer bids on everything.
That's a good point.
All right, so we're going with Flash?
Yes, the gentleman Calvin's,
We'll see if I get you, stuff you got.
We're gonna take a picture after.
What was the
this.
only
So you
one
guys-
game they made, but it was a prototype, but never went in production?
What,
Come to
that
our
who
market
made?
booth and we'll give you
Oh.
some swag.
Okay. Only one game made them.
Come to our market.
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I mean, there were a lot that were only like, you know, less than 10 made, but there was one that was only one, just one single, I have no idea.
Richie Rich.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
Was-
custom games. I mean, they made a Michael Jordan game too.
Yeah,
I
that
think.
was
a one-up.
out of a, what was, they made it out of something else.
Gary Stern had that game at one time. And he gave it to the museum in Florida.
Oh, very cool. I've never seen that. Yeah.
And it was Joe Bowser designed that game.
Well, I invite everyone to come up and play and look at this, and also touch parts if you want to see what worn out junk looks like. And I'm glad you were able to find it, because I definitely looked for some junk too, but I threw it all in the garbage a while ago. Thank you for listening
y'all
to
for
us
coming
babble,
out.
and hopefully
What? You work for Marco, you said? Next time you see Steve, tell him Johnny Norton said.
I will.
He never comes to the show anymore.
Yeah, well, it's because I come, so he has to
Ask him when he
stay.
go get a haircut.
No, he'll never get a haircut. He looks like a wizard. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, can I get a photo of all 5 of y'all real quick, and then you guys can go play? Yeah, you guys, all, you
Yeah, am I
stand-
included
yeah,
in
all
this
3 of you
awful-
stand up here.
My awful looking
Thanks
self.
so much. And then, are y'all familiar with all the tools that are in this pack?
Familiarize yourself.
So yeah, this is a
Dummies and children in the house.
flipper gauge tool.
I'm sorry?
It's the whole set of flipper,
Well, I live in South Carolina. It might be a long ways away from.
And then this is a stud buddy for your post, like a little top.
Oh, yeah.
These are a different assortment of switch adjuster tools. So for your leaf switch, so they all have kind of different angles when you need to like get in there. Make sure the game's off when you do those adjustments. File for your EOS switches to kind of clean them out, right? And then we have this cool little token drive tool that just comes in so handy at moments that you even think about it. And then snake clip, can hold wires together
well, you can
while
see,
you're
like,
soldering.
let me look at the-
Desoldering especially so they
You
don't
see how
pop
that roll
the
pin
soldering
round this
equipment.
out really
Yeah,
good?
yeah,
You've got a
absolutely.
ton
And
of
there's a
play
koozie
there.
and some
It seems like
other fun
nothing,
stuff and a hat.
right? But this will translate to a
All right, take that, I'm gonna take y'all.
Well, and especially in a much more
You wanna hold
modern
the
shape.
bag?
Yeah, hold your
Like a
bags.
snappier. This is a really old,
And then this
Williams
bit.
piece from like the 70s or something. It's an
Can we do a
EM.
photo?
Yeah, of course.
Kyle, you come on this side.
Oh, down?
One on each side.
Oh, he's coming that way.
Oh, this way.
Yeah, you can go. All right, let's get in close. Kyle, can you duck, because your face is the projector screen. Alright, 1, 2, 3, yay! Thanks,
Good job.
Kyle.
Good job.
Hey, Eric, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You're local, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I've always wanted to.
Mhm.
Isn't it cool? Eric put this through this soul.
I've never had one.
Never had one.
So when I can do something.
No, I don't know if I've ever seen one.
So did you learn
I
stuff?
don't think I've ever done anything.
The linear flipper is my favorite. People hate those things, but I love them.
I thought it was you though.
Because they're
No, it wasn't
expensive,
me. I've had a lot of games over the years, but not that
but
one.
they feel
You
amazing.
played,
why do you
my
want-
favorite game I had for
Because they're
years, I sold to get Pirates. Godly Vegas pinball.
Yeah,
That's a
I've
good
seen it.
game.
I've never owned one, but I've seen it.
Oh,
sorry.
If you had double or nothing, you'd be playing doubles, you'd be 100, maybe fixing to roll the game, he catches up to player one. It's a big.
Come check this thing out. It's kind of neat.
Whatever they do with the Silver Ball Museum.
All right, so if I want
With
to
Dan
do the
Fowler.
flipper,
He passed.
but in the flipper.
Oh, Dan
What
Ferguson?
do I need
Dan
to do?
Ferguson, yeah.
It's like an LED flipper button, like you were asking.
Lone Star, Lone Star.
You'll replace
the
It was-
button with
It's
clear
all
one.
still there. I think-
Generally, you'll
I don't
screw
think anything's
an
gonna happen
LED in that
with
has a
it.
flexible
The family
neck,
is
and you'll
still,
just point that
they haven't
LED
figured it out
at
yet.
clear
The son,
base.
so
it's
Dan
you have to just
Junior
make
passed
sure it
away.
doesn't interfere.
He was kind of interested in it, but he passed, so,
That's how it lights up.
And then you have to find.
to the best of my knowledge, all the games are still in there, 'cause that was about 3 years ago or so.
But just be careful with alligator clips. You know, they're not permanent if they
Yeah,
slip.
he was a good friend.
Well,
Yeah,
He's a good guy.
He had
find someone else.
Which one?
Vegas.
Oh, yeah, yeah. He had some
What
interest,
about
he had
the flippers themselves?
Valley Spectrum in his
I don't know,
place,
I've
which
never
was
seen
one you
that.
don't really ever see.
That's neat though.
Have you been
Yeah,
inside?
winter coat.
Oh, yeah.
I don't do a lot of the
Is it gonna
aftermarket
snow
stuff. I
yet?
spend a lot more time.
No, it's not gonna get that
restoring
cold.
and repairing
It feels
games.
so cold.
But I keep a
Everybody's
lot of
taking
games in
pictures of
arcades
snow.
around me working, so I don't do a lot of the
I
aftermarket stuff so
know,
much.
Nora.
Just
You ever talk to
repairing things later.
I think the leaded flippers are fairly recent, right?
I think not as much as I used to. I used to do
That's me.
a, I was doing a podcast, not with them, I did it locally, but I
Fortunately, we
was.
haven't had that happen.
Oh, hell,
There's
yeah.
no
Still
snow.
what you're
That's good.
So I quit doing it about
It
2
is a
years
huge
ago.
pinball show in Dallas, if you didn't know.
No, and they
about
don't really
that.
come to
Texas
the
pinball
shows
festival.
I've heard of it. I
I
haven't
did,
been to
It's a neat one.
Yeah,
It's really
right, he
called
had another
Warriors,
kid.
as opposed to this show, which kind of